The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise.
Sometimes it's like someone leaving the back window open when they go on holidays, right? And the burglars are able to get into the house. But luckily, by kind of doing those checks throughout the remediation, we were actually able to uncover that and put the gaps in place. I have come across some examples of remediation programs we've worked on where there has been one or two more egregious issues found. But thankfully, we kind of got them ahead of the curve a little bit, shall we say.
Yeah, money make a world go round. It's money make a world go round. Yeah.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world.
3, 2, 1, go!
In the fast-moving world of finance, many institutions are running at 100 miles an hour to keep up with compliance, new regulations, sanctions, and more. But sometimes it's crucial to slow down and ensure everything is running smoothly before you're forced to slam on the brakes. Remediation projects act as a critical tune-up, helping financial institutions stay ahead of fines, money laundering risks, and threats to customer funds. I'm your host, Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this episode, we are discussing why remediation projects are currently spiking. We will be discussing the factors making banks and financial services rethink their processes, the big impact of fines, and the challenges and solutions in getting remediation projects off the ground. To dive into this topic, I'm here with Steve Lamb, COO of Kyckr, and Eoin Davis, Director of Consulting Division at Davies Group. Welcome to The Laundry, both of you. I'm so glad to be here with you. Steve, what should our listeners know about you, your background, and Kyckr?
Well, thanks, Barry. It's great to be here, especially debating such an important topic. So I've been working in the world of B2B software for about the last 15 years, always on products, services that have data as a core component. I came somewhat late to the world of financial crime. I probably first heard the acronym KYC about 5 years ago. I still like to think of myself as a little bit of an outsider. But yeah, 5 years ago, joined Kyckr. We are a business verification provider focused on helping regulated entities to verify businesses at the point of onboarding and on an ongoing basis using accurate data. So to do that, we've built a live network of over 300 company registries. When our customers request data from us, we go live to them at the point of request, retrieve a profile, normalize and enrich that, and provide it back to them. So we are very involved in the world of quality data, how regulated entities can ensure that they capture good quality customer data at onboarding and then on an ongoing basis. Also really pleased to say we integrate with a range of third-party systems as well, and one of those being Strise, excitingly. So really pleased to be here.
And Eoin, welcome to The Laundry. What should listeners know about you, your background, and Davies Group?
Well, thank you very much, Marit. It's a pleasure to be here. So a little bit about myself. I've been working in financial services for over 20 years. I spent the first half of that period working within finance. I've sort of, a little bit like Steve, come into this a little later in my career, into the AML sphere. After about 10 years of finance, a lot of change and transformation there, kind of migrated into the AML world in the mid sort of 2010s as regulation started to pay a little bit more attention to what the banks may or may not have been doing in and around that time. Initially at Deutsche Bank, where obviously there was a lot of focus there, I eventually became the head of FinCrime change for DWS, the asset management business, and then migrated across into consulting in the last number of years, particularly with Davies Group, where I've been there for about 3 years. So Davies Group itself is a very large professional services and technology firm. I work within the consulting division of that, specifically within the client lifecycle management team. So we service our clients across capital markets with whatever their CLM needs may be. And that could be from an advisory perspective, looking at target operating models, how to develop, enhance and build them, with the delivery piece and also with the technology selection as well. And, we're very interested in sort of working with the likes of Strise, who we've kind of recently engaged with and tried to understand the landscape of the technology and how that helps kind of improve people's processes and pain points around the world of AML, and in particular KYC remediation being quite a topical item for us as an organization.
Thanks for the introduction, both of you. Let's dive into the discussion. So the title of the episode is Why Are Remediation Projects Spiking? So we should start there, because Steve, you and I met in London, and that's when this topic came out, when we had a meeting and we were sitting there discussing like, there's a lot of remediation projects going on, but from your perspective, to the two of you, why are they spiking just now? Steve, why don't you start? Do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, the main data point I'm seeing is just the volume of conversations that Kyckr is having with our customers, really, about remediation projects over the last 6 months. And I guess that the specific angle of that, as far as Kyckr is concerned, is basically periodic refresh. So reconducting CDD processes on a periodic basis to keep that data up to date. Now, I would put this in the context that Kyckr is a small but growing business, fast growing. But prior to 2024, it used to be the case that we might be brought in to work on maybe 1, maybe 2 big remediation projects a year, maybe a further 1 or 2 per quarter, but much smaller, a few hundred entities here and there. Well, since October last year, we've completed 4 substantial projects, interestingly, all with technology companies, which I'm sure we'll come on to. And we have a further 2 about to start as well. So it feels to me like there's been a general realization in the AML space that remediation isn't something that can be ignored. I think there's a number of reasons for that, which I'm sure we'll come on to: regulatory, fines, enforcement. But I think for a long time, it felt to me a little bit like there were some heads being buried in the sand. And especially when it came to periodic refresh, I think there was a period, probably early 2020s, when people were waiting for some kind of panacea of a perpetual KYC solution that would just keep data updated on an ongoing basis and remove the need to do this kind of refresh. Well, I don't think we're quite at that golden era yet, or that solution quite exists. So remediation is becoming increasingly important.
And Eoin, do you agree that remediation projects are spiking first and foremost? Like, what do you see in the consulting arm?
I'm going to say yes and no here, right? Which is maybe a classic consulting answer, but I'm going to give a little bit of context as to why I say that. I do agree with a lot of what Steve has said there, all right? Okay, I think there was a lot of focus in the earlier part of this decade around perpetual KYC and what it was going to do, as it was kind of like a silver bullet that was going to fix everything. I think it hasn't quite arrived at the speed that people thought it may do. So it has certainly forced some people, and we know from our clients and the conversations we have, that remediation is, I don't want to say back in vogue. My view is that it never kind of went out of, the focus that people have upon it. Like it's almost been constant remediation. I think the drivers behind it, which we will touch on later, have probably shifted a little bit. I think you go back maybe 10, 12 years ago, so some of the larger organizations, it was very much driven by enforcement actions. Okay. We can talk to examples of organizations. I've worked in one of them, which were really driven by regulatory pressure that forced remediation. And that obviously has the domino effect, because other people will look across the street and go, if they've gone in there, they're going to come to me next, right? So that kind of drives that. And, I think we live in an evolving world, right? Nothing ever stands still. There's geopolitical aspects, which we feel the ramifications of today. The news is particularly in the last number of months, has been changing quite a lot. And that has an impact on what we see throughout the system as well, because it changes risk appetites incredibly quickly. So the need for remediation never goes away. I do agree with Steve on the periodic refresh, but I think that's always been there in the background. It sort of comes down a little bit around a prioritization point, really, within organizations, because with the best will in the world, we can only spend so much on a KYC process, right? And that obviously will have focus that is greater and lower at certain times.
Let's look into some of these, drivers that you said, and it's changing. Is the recent slew of fines for compliance failures, is that something that is driving the demand for remediation, or is it other things, such as like the increase in sanctions? When you are out speaking to your clients, what is it that they worry about? Like, what is it that keeps them up at night and then makes them go, we need to do this remediation now? It's
a multitude of things, really, and you've touched upon a lot of them. Sanctions is definitely right. Okay, people kind of look back to 2022's invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and obviously that had a huge impact on the number of sanctioned individuals across OFAC in the US, HMT in the UK, and the EU, etc. But if you go back to 2014, when they first invaded Crimea and the Donbass, OFAC was releasing lists throughout the late 2010s, almost on a monthly basis, with updated lists of Russian oligarchs. So that's a sort of a constant thing. I think the regulatory censure is an interesting point, because obviously the pandemic changed a lot. So we talk about that changing working patterns, but it also kind of paused certain elements of regulatory action, because we were living in a very different world very, very suddenly. Those kind of fines, we've started to see them come back into focus. There's a couple of very topical examples in the UK, particularly around the likes of Starling, the likes of Monzo, within the last kind of 12 to 18 months that have come through. And I think that has made people sit up and realize when they look at the root causes of what that was, in terms of there's a moratorium on high-risk clients, but yet certain organizations continue to do that, right? Continue to onboard high-risk clients, right? So I think there are two critical factors within it, right? That we see which are almost external to organizations that they can't kind of control because then they look at their peers being fined or they see sanctions. But I think where that starts to see an internal pressure is really around internal audit, who, do look outside. That it's internal, but they're externally focused as well. They will look away at what's happening in the market and they'll start to come in and do more reviews around KYC processes. And we have started to see a lot more remediation exercises be driven by internal audit, which I think is actually a positive because organizations are getting ahead of this before facing, FCA, the Fed. I mean, they fined TD $3 billion last year.
U.S. authorities have slapped TD Bank with a historic $3 billion fine after the bank pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit money laundering.
TD Bank created an environment that allowed financial crime to flourish. By making its services convenient for criminals, it became one.
The Fed don't mess around when it comes to fines, so there's a certain fear factor with that internal audit are being driven by. But I actually would see that as a positive because organizations are really capturing those challenges before they, formally hit home.
What do you hear in the market, Steve, when people are coming and saying, we need to do a remediation project? What is it that keeps them up at night? What's the biggest worries? What is driving this from their perspective?
Yeah, I think the fines do have an impact. As an industry, we're very close-knit. We talk, these things get noticed. No one wants to have that on their record, that they've been associated with an entity with deficient practices, although I do have a lot of empathy for people in that situation because it's a team sport. And I think, I would agree that the Starling fine in particular resonated. Here's a large fine handed out for, amongst other things, specific technical failures. And it shows the teeth of the regulator, pointing to those things and also following up, right, on activities that were identified back in 2021. Something I think that is really driving the demand from our perspective is specific changes in regulation occurring in different countries.
Are there any countries that are pointing out or has some sort of very specific regulatory change that is driving it?
Yeah, I mean, they're all different pieces of legislation with slightly different terms, but they all relate to a central point, which is bringing more organizations into regulation. I'll just give you very quickly three that have hit home for us. So one is Canada. So Canada's making a number of regulatory changes under its Proceeds of Crime Act. Implementation's been moved forward to April 1st, 6 months earlier than planned. So that's going to bring in sectors into scope, including factoring companies, payroll services, leasing, financing. Actually, those two major projects I mentioned earlier, a lot of the remediation there is on Canadian customers for that reason. So you've got organizations that traditionally did not need to have the same strength of processes as some of the banks and other financial institutions suddenly coming into scope. Similar in Australia, so Tranche 2 next year will bring law firms, accountants under regulation in Australia, something that's happened a lot later than other countries. But again, that's causing a look at existing customer books and processes.
Yeah, FATF is threatening to put Australia on the grey list if they don't have more industries comply to the AML legislations.
Yeah, crazy when you think of it, such a developed economy like Australia. But yeah, that is a real risk. And something they're looking actively at. The last one actually is really interesting because it's not a piece of AML legislation. So you've got this directive in Europe called DAC7, which is actually a tax directive, requires any website or application enabling seller to user commerce. So your eBays, Etsy's, Amazon's, Google's, those platforms now need to collect as of this year and verify quite extensive information on sellers. So it essentially mandates KYB. And periodic KYB, despite those firms not, traditionally being considered part of the AML space. So for us, I think that has been the key driving factor is organizations that are not typical Kyckr customers, maybe not typical Strise customers either, coming to us and saying, look, we're sat on tens of thousands of records of existing customers and we just don't know our data. We don't know what the risk profile is of them. So needing to go back and remediate that's become a key concern.
I can only imagine if you are a company that has operated without any AML legislation, you've got your customers, and then suddenly you're like, whoa, I'm supposed to do all these KYC. I think that would be a pretty big surprise to people if they're not familiar with this beforehand. But thanks for that, guys. We will be right back to talk about how remediation projects work and the biggest challenges to overcome.
I want to introduce you to a game changer in the compliance and portfolio risk management, the Strise Portfolio Health Dashboard. This new feature gives you comprehensive overview of your portfolio risk right from your Strise homepage. What we've built is tackling 3 of the most critical challenges we all face when it comes to portfolio health. 1, the lack of visibility into portfolio level risk. 2, relying on time-consuming and fragmented data sources. 3, missed compliance obligations due to unclear and inaccessible data. From feedback with compliance officers using our product, we know that having access to a central view is vital in being able to quickly identify PEPs, sanctions, and risk levels across all entities, so you can quickly identify high-risk accounts that need immediate attention. And for those of you working as risk analysts, it's likely that you'll want to be alerted about any up-and-coming reviews for high-risk accounts to ensure a timely and effective risk management. That's exactly why we've created the Portfolio Health Dashboard. Stay tuned for what's next.
So, welcome back. We've talked about the reasons for remediation projects in the wider markets, but let's look into the challenges when putting them together. Eoin, maybe you can start. What do you see as the biggest challenge to overcome when starting a remediation project?
I think when you're trying to get a remediation project underway, right, I think tone from the top is critical, right? So we've thankfully moved on from a world where KYC was sort of seen as an admin task, okay? There's now a greater understanding of risk ownership, particularly in the first line, right? I've seen this with a number of clients trying to get that accountability within organizations. For those that actually are risk owners, they understand that the full aspect of the risk includes KYC risk as well, right? So when these programs are trying to be kicked off, right, there has to be buy-in from those that own the client relationships, because there isn't a client outreach aspect to this, whether people like that or not. And it's, what Steve has alluded to there about different industries now having to do that in the last section of the show, that outreach piece is incredibly important. People are going to have to do that, and it can be damaging from a relationship perspective, but we need to have that tone from the top in an organization to ensure that people are understanding the need behind this, and that it is being driven by those in the organization with the power to really make that change. Okay. And I think if we're trying to get that off the ground and things running properly, I think that's just the best way to do it.
When you run, let's say, a remediation project, why don't you talk our listeners through how you guys do it, how you set it up, how many analysts do you usually bring in, or how much manual work, and how much is project management versus actually doing the remediation? Just give us a little flavor.
Yeah, no. And look, I mean, there's a kind of I'll paint some sort of broad brush strokes here with this, but at the start, there's really a scoping exercise to understand the scale. So how many customers is it that need to be remediated? And then there's also a complexity aspect as well. So whilst traditionally organizations will have high, medium, and low, within that, you're going to have a greater understanding around about where is the complexity here. We all assume it's the high risk, okay? But, different customer types. Is it a retail book? Is it an institutional book, and so forth? So the scoping exercise is critical around that. The other aspect that needs to be looked at beyond that really is around the governance, okay? And understanding who our sponsors are, who are the key people we need to go to. And I think once we have that in place, we can really get into execution mode, where we start looking at what outreach looks like. What's the format for that? Can be phone calls, emails, the use of a customer portal as well in certain cases, which can sort of aid. And I know we have Steve from the tech world here who probably agree with this. The likes of a portal would probably improve getting documents back from customers quite significantly. And then, we always kind of look at trying to use a workflow tool so we can actually sort of track the process around this. That'll allow the production of MI, so we can start to understand how many cases we do in a day, how many cases we do in a week. And we have that reporting cycle as well, back to what the governance structure is, so we can understand what we've done and how we're tracking against the time taken, because when we're through this process, right, we need to understand how many cases there are, the time taken to do that case, and then obviously an individual case, how many hours that will be, and how many people we need to stack up against that, right? because we're always going to have a point in time exercise where this needs to be completed by. And if we're going to do that, we need to ensure that we have the resources set up to do so. So that's kind of our broad approach that we would take to running one of these exercises.
Steve, you've been part of a lot of remediation projects as a vendor into it. How much have you seen of like complete overhauls versus you come in, you pull registry data, it's into an existing system that works perfectly fine. You know, this was just a data pull that was easy to do. Like how have you seen these projects run from the outside? Complete mess or very easy?
I think the really interesting thing is that we are often brought in for a very specific task, which is, can you match our customer book to corporate registries? Tell us when there's a match, and if there is, can you remediate the data? So, quite a lengthy task in some cases, and although we're employing, a significant degree of technology, but quite simple to understand. Now, the really interesting thing is the questions that throws up around the KYC process, and I think that's the thing people don't necessarily expect when they engage us, or the realizations that might come from that. So let me just give you an example. It is not uncommon for us to get a book of customer business, and we'll open the Excel sheet and we'll look down the first few rows, and it might be customer name brackets do not contact is the recorded customer name. It might be a brand name that their customer hasn't used for 5 years. It might be a string of numbers instead of a recorded name. Now, we can remediate that and we can match that against a corporate registry. But what does that tell you about your practices in terms of how you capture data from customers and how you record that? Well, for me, that requires some degree of change. So it's amazing how often that happens, that through the exercise of going through customer remediation, it demonstrates some of the weaknesses in processes. And actually, even on a pure basis, that single number of a match rate, how much does your data match what's in the registry, can be quite a good indicator of the health of your KYB processes as well.
I think you touched upon something interesting there. I mean, do not contact this customer. And I mean, also what you said, Eoin, it's the human element, because someone needs to run this project. There is a head of AML involved. There is a lot of people who need to do this manually. So I'll get onto the topic of AI in a minute, but there is this human element that you can't just fully automate your way out of. And it's also the customer relationship that should be taken into account. So how do you see the human element in the projects? And by that, I mean, head of AML communicating to the C-suite, and also head of AML or you, Eoin, as the consultant, making sure the team is motivated and work towards the targets. And I mean, it's repetitive work as well. Like, how have you seen that play out in different projects? If you start, Eoin, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I view technology as an enabler, okay? And it can help us improve processes here, right? But totally agree with you. We cannot move away from the human element here, right? And the communication here has to be two-way. I've talked a little bit earlier about tone from the top, but the tone from the top has to be influenced from the ground as well, so that, that understanding of the serious nature of what we're seeking to do here. And the example, like, yes, there might be customers that need to be handled with sort of care, do not contact, whatever assignations we have beside them, just to ensure that we have specific processes around that and ensure that that's communicated up above as well. Because when I talked earlier around, the steps in terms of trying to lay out a remediation project, as you're scoping it, that's going to be a factor that will impact your timelines, right? So I talked about complexity. Steve has, in effect, given a prime example of where you find complexity with that. And that's the sort of messaging that needs to go upward in an organization in terms of managing expectations of senior management. And I'd say that from a consulting perspective, but also from the perspective of having done this inside a bank as well, that kind of managing the expectations above of what is truly achievable within that time frame is critical. And then also, I think the communication is the other way as well, that when we communicate with the customers, it's clear what we're trying to do here and what we're seeking to achieve, right? That, whilst it might be a little bit painful, it's a necessary step for us to take, because in as much as the bank is protecting itself, it also has a duty of care to protect its customers and the wider financial ecosystem as well.
Yeah, definitely. And Steve, to build further on, I guess, the human element, but bridge it over to AI. Have you seen any remediation projects completed by AI lately? And do you think an AI agent can handle an end-to-end remediation projects? If I was the head of AML, I could just sit there, I would type into a ChatGPT interface and be like, I want to do a remediation project now, enter, and then AI would just go out and do it. What do you think the future holds, and how far are we?
So I'm a techno optimist, so I think that will come. there will come a point where an agentic system can automate the majority of that activity, but we're certainly not there yet. And, I would really, really caution our customers, any organization who's thinking, we could just fire some of this stuff at an AI model and we can expect that to work. It will go off, it will pull data from different sources. If you're dealing with thousands of entries, that's a huge amount of contextual data for a large language model. So unless you're using very sophisticated, retrieval augmented systems, then it's not going to produce the required result. And what inevitably happens at the moment is firms realize this and they know they need to have a human eyeballing the result of that. So actually you can end up increasing the effort through, not particularly well-governed use of AI. There are definitely roles for AI as it currently stands. I mean, we are investing heavily in looking at data extraction. So 95% of the world's corporate registry information is stored in PDF documents. AI is great for extracting that, making it usable. Entity resolution is another one. How do you compare across different data sets with different identifiers? And there's a role there. But it needs to be, proportionate, I think is the main thing, and have very strict governance around it if you are going to look at doing that.
We are nearing the end of the episode, but I just got to ask, have you been part of any remediation projects that just uncovered a huge kind of financial crime risk that the client was not aware of? That we had this type book of business that actually turned out to be, extremely high risk, but we weren't aware, and we are exposed to all this type of risk. Have you been part of such a project?
Thankfully not. I would say I have been sent names of organisations to remediate that are in, let's just put heavily sanctioned jurisdictions, which is always raises an eyebrow. But no, we're mainly dealing with, like I said, that initial verification of entities. So I think the things that concern me, and this does happen, but in all honesty, I'm kind of glad that we're having the conversation with them when it does. It's about the quality of data. And actually what is being captured and how that's being captured at onboarding.
And Eoin, have you been part of uncovering major financial crime risk during remediation?
Sadly, yes. Right. I think it's the answer to that question, that we have kind of lifted up the rock and seen some of the startled earwigs underneath, to use an analogy. We have, in certain instances throughout my career, come across issues that we thought was a simpler remediation, and that turned into something a little bit more complex beyond that. And I think that's a positive, though, that we did find it, because we were actually able to make recommendations and then go to implement controls around stopping that type of behavior, or really the potential for that type of behavior. Because I think sometimes it's like someone leaving the back window open when they go on holidays, right? And the burglars are able to get into the house. But luckily, by kind of doing those checks throughout the remediation, we were actually able to uncover that and put the gaps in place. I have come across a couple, without giving names away, some examples of remediation programs we've worked on where there has been one or two more egregious issues found. But thankfully, we kind of got them ahead of the curve a little bit, shall we say.
That's why remediation projects matter in the real world, because ultimately it's about understanding financial crime threats and keeping the customers and the financial system safe against money launderers and fraudulent players. But we are now at the end of the episode. But before we leave you, we will dish out some quick fire questions. So I'll ask a question. You will say the first thing that comes to mind. And Eoin, you can start. What is the top sign it is time to start looking at a remediation project?
When there's been regulatory changes, okay, and you realize that you're slightly different, right, okay, and I'm going to parallel that with audit findings as well. If you have an internal audit review, you got to go for it.
Steve?
Yeah, expansion on the last point, too few, too many escalations can indicate systemic problems. On the customer data front, repeated spotting of inaccuracies, I think, as well.
What is the biggest cause of the current spike in remediation projects?
New regulation, I'd have to say.
Eoin?
Data quality.
What is the one thing you should keep in mind when running a remediation project?
I'm going to go back to data again and say data accuracy and completeness is the most critical piece to completing the project.
Steve?
Well, you might expect me to say this, but I completely agree. Absolutely, data quality.
I teed you up there, Steve.
And final one. What is the one thing a head of compliance needs to say to convince their bosses that it's worthwhile?
Frame it as an investment in operational resilience, insurance policy in many respects, rather than a compliance cost.
Eoin?
Similar, if you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance.
that brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Steve and Eoin, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Steve Lamb or /SJ Lamb, and visit us at www.kyckr.com.
And you can find me on LinkedIn under Eoin Davis, pretty unique spelling of my name, so you can't really miss me. And the website is www.davies-group.com.
And thanks to everyone who was listening and interested in why remediation projects are currently spiking. If you've enjoyed this episode, go check out the back catalog of more than 100 episodes and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. That's right, we've done over 100 episodes. It's our 3rd year of The Laundry and it feels like we're just getting started. We'd love for you to share the podcast on LinkedIn, tell a colleague about it, or give us a 5-star rating on your podcast app. It really helps get the message out there. What subjects do you think we should be talking about? Comment on the Strise LinkedIn, my LinkedIn, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Marit, our producer was Matthew, our editor was Dominic, and our engineer was Nicholas. And The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
Great job! I got everything on camera, so you'll watch it later, huh? You're the greatest!
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise.